Hello again. It's been a while since I posted anything, because I was absolutely overwhelmed at work and was also trying to go a bit more offline with my friendships. I think I'll continue this trend, as the internet is quickly becoming a more and more bizarre place, as I hope you'll see from today's video. And I'm going to counter that with making stained glass windows. The symbolic world community, not unlike the rest of the world, has recently been trying to understand the meaning of artificial intelligence, what it really is, and what effect it's going to have on our reality. The first and most immediate thing to notice is that the whole information technology revolution follows the pattern of the rebellion of the oppressed margins, the revenge of the nerds, if you will. In our common cultural perception, a nerd is more intellectually capable than an average person, more potent, while usually lacking in physical prowess and, more importantly, social skills, ability to relate to other people and empathize. Pair that with a certain level of contempt towards others, partially coming from being discriminated against due to their awkwardness and partially due to their intellectual superiority, and you'll understand the direction the fourth industrial revolution is going. Radical atomization, further individualization, destruction of societal bonds, and so on. But artificial intelligence is a whole new level of complexity of the issue, or at least it appears to be so. And we finally started asking questions about extra-human agency, consciousness, and will. Jonathan Pajot points out that while AI may seem like an independent being, it still feeds on the very human intelligence, and, what's more, it is designed by other humans, with their own agency, intentions, and goals, or who are serving some other, higher agency. This is why, if we want to see the future of AI unfolding, it might be worthwhile to try to analyze and understand the principalities behind the motivations of major figures in the AI world. Which brings us to our today's topic. Joscha Bach, a genius scientist, involved in one way or another in every major AI project today. Mr. Bach is a self-proclaimed nerd, and you can hear it. He thinks differently and on a different level than your average Joe, and he seems used to not being understood. I recently listened to several hours of Lex Fridman interviews with Joscha Bach to find out who he is, what drives him, and what his values are. Let's dive in.
Talk about what is dualism, what is idealism, what is materialism, what is functionalism, and what connects with you most in terms of, because he just mentioned there's a reality we don't have access to. Mm-hmm. Okay. What does that even mean? And why don't we get access to it? Aren't we part of that reality? Why can't we access it?
So the particular trajectory that mostly exists in the West is the result of our indoctrination by a cult for 2000 years.
A cult? Which
yes,
one?
The Catholic cult mostly.
Yes.
And for better or worse, right? It has created or defined many of the modes of interaction that we have that has created this society, but it has also in some sense scarred our rationality. And the intuition that exists, if you would translate the mythology of the Catholic Church into the modern world, is that the world in which you and me interact is something like a multiplayer role-playing adventure.
Yes.
And the money and the objects that we have in this world, this is all not real. Or as Eastern philosophers would say, it's Maya. It's just stuff that it appears to be meaningful, and this embedding in this meaning, if you believe in it, is samsara. It's basically the identification with the needs of the mundane, secular, everyday existence. And the Catholics also introduced the notion of higher meaning, the sacred. And this existed before, but eventually the natural shape of God is the Platonic form of the civilization that you're part of. It's basically the superorganism that is formed by the individuals as an intentional agent. And basically the Catholics used a relatively crude mythology to implement software on the minds of people and get the software synchronized to make them walk in lockstep, to basically get this God online and to make it efficient and effective.
Quite early in the interview, we can hear Joscha single out the Catholic Church as the main engine behind our culture. It's interesting because I think that mostly the West that he is thinking about, the United States, Western Europe, was built in the past few hundred years mostly by Protestantism. But as we will hear later, he's not so much against Protestantism, but you can already see here that the Catholic Church is especially malicious. By reducing the idea of the place of the human being in the world to a comparison with an RPG game, we see that he's trying to banalize it, completely ignoring the fact that RPG games are made to imitate real life. It's also interesting how he says that Catholics manipulate people. Who are those Catholics? Where did they come from? And how are they ruling the world? Hard to tell. But I guess those manipulators are not the people, but the people are manipulated by them. What he also displays here is certain knowledge about Eastern philosophies. One thing that I want to tell you at this point is just that Joscha Bach comes from Eastern Germany. He grew up in behind the Berlin Wall, behind the Iron Curtain. And if you were from these regions, you would know that Eastern Germany was especially harshly attacked by the New Age philosophy, by Eastern influences, and the occult in the past 40 or 50 years. Let's move on.
So the weird thing is we don't exist in the physical world. We do exist inside of a story that the brain tells itself.
Okay, let me my information processing take that in. We don't exist in the physical world. We exist in the narrative.
Basically, a brain cannot feel anything. A neuron cannot feel anything. They're physical things. Physical systems are unable to experience anything. But it would be very useful for the brain or for the organism to know what it would be like to be a person and to feel something.
Yeah.
So the brain creates a simulacrum of such a person that it uses to model the interactions of the person. It's the best model of what that brain, this organism, thinks it is in relationship to its environment. So it creates that model. It's a story, a multimedia novel that the brain is continuously writing and updating.
But
we need to notice how brilliant Mr. Joscha Bach is. His thinking is really capable of connecting the nerdy, scientific and physical and mathematical stuff with the abstract, the symbolic, the humanist. There are very few people like that, and on this level of understanding reality. However, what we hear in this fragment at the beginning sounds like something that Jonathan Pajot or Jordan Peterson could say, that we live in a story. But then there's a continuation that the brain tells itself. We are going to need this for subsequent fragments. Stay with me.
You've said on this topic, you said in a recent conversation that, quote, some people think that a simulation can't be conscious and only a physical system can, but they got it completely backward. A physical system cannot be conscious. Only a simulation can be conscious.
Yeah.
Consciousness is a simulated property of the simulated self. Just like you said, the mind is kind of we'll call it story, narrative. There's a simulation, so our mind is essentially a simulation.
Usually, I try to use the terminology so that the mind is basically the principles that produce the simulation. It's the software that is implemented by your brain.
Yeah.
And the mind is creating both the universe that we are in and the self. the idea of a person that is on the other side of attention and is embedded in this world.
Why is that important, that idea of a self? Why is that an important feature in the simulation?
It's basically a result of the purpose that the mind has. It's a tool for modeling, right? We are not actually monkeys. We are side effects of the regulation needs of monkeys. And what the monkey has to regulate is the relationship of an organism to an outside world that is in large part also consisting of other organisms.
What we can notice here, and it will repeat in further fragments, is that Joscha Bach uses language from the IT realm to describe things that are going on in the human mind or in the human soul. The reason for that, I suspect, is the most grave thing that I was expecting from the very beginning of the AI revolution, is that it isn't necessarily about artificial intelligence becoming human-like, but it's more about reducing human beings to artificial intelligence, to software, to mechanisms, robots.
And so these priors that you commit to are largely target values that our needs should approach, set points. And this deviation to the set point creates some urge, some tension. And we find ourselves living inside of feedback loops, right? Consciousness emerges over dimensions of disagreements with the universe. Things where you care, where things are not the way they should be, where you need to regulate. And so in some sense, the sense self is the result of all the identifications that you're having. And identification is a regulation target that you're committing to. It's a dimension that you care about, that you think is important. And this is also what locks you in. If you let go of these commitments, of these identifications, you get free. There's nothing that you have to do anymore. And if you let go of all of them, you're completely free and you can enter nirvana because you're done.
Again, a member of the Western civilization thinking in terms of the Eastern notions. The theme of losing one's identity and being one with everything else will prevail in these interviews.
But why does the simulation feel like something?
So if you look at a book by, say, George R.R. Martin, where the characters have plausible psychology, and they stand on a hill because they want to conquer the city below the hill, and they're done in it, and they look at the color of the sky, and they are apprehensive and feel empowered and all these things. Why do they have these emotions? It's because it's written into the story, right? And it's written into the story because it's an adequate model of the person that predicts what they're going to do next. And the same thing is true for us. So it's basically a story that our brain is writing. It's not written in words. It's written in perceptual content, basically multimedia content. And it's a model of what the person would feel if it existed. So it's a virtual person. And you and me happen to be this virtual person. So this virtual person gets access to the language center and talks about the sky being blue. And this is us.
Now, this way of thinking is very attractive at first glance because it seems to deviate from pure materialism and tries to offer something else. But it also seems that the thing that it's trying to offer is at the other end of the spectrum. Nothing is real, nothing's concrete, everything's ethereal and simulated and modeled.
The weird thing is I don't actually have an identity beyond the identity that I construct. If I was the Dalai Lama, he identifies as a form of government. So basically the Dalai Lama gets reborn, not because he's confused, but because he is not identifying as a human being. He runs on a human being. He's basically a governmental software that is instantiated in every new generation anew. So his advisors will pick someone who does this in the next generation. So if you identify with this, you are no longer a human and you don't die in the sense. So what dies is only the body of the human that you run on. To kill the Dalai Lama, you would have to kill his tradition. And if we look at ourselves, we realize that we are to a small part like this, most of us. So for instance, if you have children, you realize something lives on in them. Or if you spark an idea in the world, something lives on. Or if you identify with a society around you. Because you are in part that. You're not just this human being.
Yeah, so in a sense, you are kind of like a Dalai Lama in the sense that you, Joscha Bach, is just a collection of ideas. So like you have this operating system on which a bunch of ideas live and interact, and then once you die, they kind of some of them jump off the ship.
Put it the other way. Identity is a software state. It's a construction. It's not physically real. Identity is not a physical concept. It's basically a representation of different objects on the same world line.
I really recommend that everyone interested in symbolic thinking listen to these interviews, because here again we have a very nice display of Joscha Bach's ability to think in hierarchies, for example, hierarchies of belonging to a thing or to a bigger thing, hierarchies of identity. However, you have to be watchful, because there's always a catch somewhere. Here it is, probably self-identification. Identity, apart from being an illusion, a construct, is something that you choose for yourself, in his words. I'm not sure it is true. What do you think?
So the world that we subjectively interact with is fundamentally the result of the representation mechanisms in our brain. They are mathematically to some degree universal. There are certain regularities that you can discover in the patterns and not others.
Yes.
But the patterns that we get, this is not the real world. The world that we interact with is always made of too many parts to count, right? So when you look at this table and so on, it's consisting of so many molecules and atoms that you cannot count them. So you only look at the aggregate dynamics, at limit dynamics. If you had almost infinitely many particles, what would be the dynamics of the table? And this is roughly what you get. So geometry that we are interacting with is the result of discovering those operators that work in the limit that you get by building an infinite series that converges. For those parts where it converges, it's geometry. For those parts where it doesn't converge, it's chaos.
Again, this is something that Jonathan Pajot could say, but in a different language probably. There's an infinite amount of phenomena, and we perceive them as one. And when we do perceive them as one, we have order. But if things do not act as one, there's chaos. Interesting, huh?
You said culture, but you really mean the spirit of the civilization. The entirety of the civilization may not exist for long.
Yeah. So
can you untangle that? What's your intuition behind that? So you kind of offline mentioned to me that the Industrial Revolution was kind of the moment we agreed to accept the offer, sign on the paper on the dotted line with the Industrial Revolution, we doomed ourselves. Can you elaborate on that?
This is suspicion. I, of course, don't know how it plays out. But
of course.
It seems to me that in a society in which you leverage yourself very far over an entropic abyss without land on the other side, it's relatively clear that your cantilever is at some point going to break down into this entropic abyss, and you have to pay the bill.
Okay.
Entropic abyss. I always wondered why Matthew Pajot didn't use the word entropy in his book to describe chaos. Because for me it's the same. Where's entropy, there's chaos. Where's chaos, there's entropy. That you need to structure to get some kind of an order, some kind of a oneness. Now, as far as the Industrial Revolution goes, we can say that the pattern has to play itself out. This gives me chills.
It's likely that we should ascribe a certain degree of intelligence to plants. The problem is that plants don't have a nervous system. So they don't have a way to telegraph messages over large distances almost instantly in the plant. And instead, they will rely on chemicals between adjacent cells, which means the signal processing speed depends on the signal processing with a rate of a few millimeters per second.
Yes.
And as a result, if the plant is intelligent, it's not going to be intelligent at similar timescales as us.
Yeah, the brilliant puts the timescale is different. So you suspect we might not be the most intelligent, but we're the most intelligent in this spatial scale
yes.
and our time scale.
So basically, if you would zoom out very far, we might discover that there have been intelligent ecosystems on the planet that existed for thousands of years in a almost undisturbed state. And it could be that these ecosystems actively related their environment. So basically change the course of the evolution within this ecosystem to make it more efficient and less brittle.
So it's possible something like plants is actually a set of living organisms, an ecosystem of living organisms that are just operating at a different time scale and are far superior in intelligence than human beings. And then human beings will die out and plants will still be there and they'll be there.
Yeah, there's an evolutionary adaptation playing a role at all of these levels. For instance, if mice don't get enough food and get stressed, the next generation of mice will be more sparse and more scrawny. And the reason for this is because they, in a natural environment, the mice have probably hit a drought or something else. And if they overgraze, then all the things that sustain them might go extinct. And there will be no mice a few generations from now. So to make sure that there will be mice in 5 generations from now, basically the mice scale back. And a similar thing happens with the predators of mice. They should make sure that the mice don't completely go extinct.
Yeah.
So in some sense, if the predators are smart enough, they will be tasked with shepherding their food supply. And maybe the reason why lions have much larger brains than antelopes is not so much because it's so hard to catch an antelope as opposed to run away from the lion, but the lions need to make complex models of their environment, more complex than the antelopes.
So first of all, just describing that there's a bunch of complex systems and human beings may not even be the most special or intelligent of those complex systems, even on Earth, makes me feel a little better about the extinction of human species that we're talking about.
Yes, maybe we are just Gaia's ploy to put the carbon back into the atmosphere.
Yeah, this is just a nice, we tried it out.
The big stain on evolution is not us, it was trees. Earth evolved trees before they could be digested again, right? There were no insects that could break all of them apart. Cellulose is so robust that you cannot get all of it with microorganisms. So many of these trees fell into swamps. And all this carbon became inert and could no longer be recycled into organisms. And we are the species that is destined to take care of that.
So there's this kind of...
dig it out of the ground, put it back into the atmosphere, and the Earth is already greening.
Yeah.
So within a million years or so, when the ecosystems have recovered from the rapid changes that they're not compatible with right now, the Earth is going to be awesome again.
And there won't be even a memory of us little apes.
I think there will be memories of us. I suspect we are the first generally intelligent species in this sense. We are the first species with an industrial society because we will leave more phones than bones in the stratosphere.
Well, see, phones than bones. I like it. But then let me push back. You've kind of suggested that we have a very narrow definition of intelligence. I mean, why aren't trees more general, a higher level of general intelligence?
Well, if trees were intelligent, then they would be at different timescales, which means within 100 years, the tree is probably not going to make models that are as complex as the ones that we make in 10 years.
But maybe the trees are the ones that made the phones. Right? Like,
well, you could say the entirety of life did it. You know, the first cell never died. The first cell only split, right? And divided. And every cell in our body is still an instance of the first cell that split off from that very first cell. There was only one cell on this planet as far as we know.
Yeah.
And so the cell is not just a building block of life. It's a hyperorganism, right? And we are part of this hyperorganism.
Now, this is the first, but definitely not the last time, where the concept of Gaia appears in the interview. And it's an interesting concept, because if you can think hierarchically, you notice that we are a part of all life on Earth, and that we somehow do belong to this single entity of sorts. However, why is it so deceptive? Why is Gaia one of the main concepts of the New Age thinking? We'll get to that later.
Then what happens after we die? So, because,
why would you care? You will not be longer there. The point of dying is that you are gone.
Well, maybe I'm not. This is what, it seems like there's so much in the idea that this is just, the mind is just a simulation that's constructing a narrative around some particular aspects of the quantum mechanical wave function world that we can't quite get direct access to. then like the idea of mortality seems to be a little fuzzy as well. It does, maybe there's not a clear end.
No, the fuzzy idea is the one of continuous existence. We don't have continuous existence.
How do you know that? Like that?
Because it's not computable.
Because you're saying it's going to be
There is no
directly
continuous
infinite.
process. The only thing that binds you together with the Lex Fridman from yesterday is the illusion that you have memories about him. So
Right.
if you want to upload, it's very easy. You make a machine that thinks it's you. Because it's the same thing that you are. You are a machine that thinks it's you.
But that's immortality.
Yeah,
That-
but it's just a belief. You can create this belief very easily. Once you realize that the question whether you are immortal or not depends entirely on your beliefs and your own continuity.
But then you can be immortal by the continuity of the belief.
You cannot be immortal, but you can stop being afraid of your mortality because you realize you were never continuously existing in the first place.
Well, I don't know if I'd be more terrified or less terrified by that. It seems like the fact that I existed.
Also, you don't know this state in which you don't have a self. You can turn off yourself,
I can't turn
You
off
can turn it
myself.
off. You can turn it off.
I can.
Yes, so you can basically meditate yourself in a state where you are still conscious, where still things are happening, where you know everything that you knew before, but you're no longer identified with changing anything. And this means that yourself, in a way, dissolves. There is no longer this person. You know that this person construct exists in other states, and it runs on this brain of Lex Fridman,
Yeah.
but it's not a real thing. It's a construct. It's an idea. And you can change that idea. And if you let go of this idea, if you don't think that you are special, you realize it's just one of many people and it's not your favorite person even, right? It's just one of many.
Yeah.
And it's the one that you are doomed to control for the most part. And that is basically informing the actions of this organism
Yeah.
as a control model. And this is all there is. And
Here in this short fragment, we have quite a few things. First of all, a strong statement that eternal life is impossible. Then a casual claim that you're a machine of sorts, which I was pointing to before, that humans are being reduced to something that would fit the AI, that would be possible to fit in with AI in the same category. Then your identity, yourself, your being is not a real thing, whatever real is. And then at the very end, that's all there is. That's all there is. So this kind of reductionism appears again and again and again in this interview, which stands in contrast with the capability of thinking symbolically that Joscha Bach already displayed. When you reduce things to just one level and say that's all there is, like in the famous interview Jonathan had with Matt Fradd, where a female breast was reduced to a sack of fat, you notice that someone is trying to rob you of something, of some meaning, by reducing a phenomenon to just one stage and telling you that that's all there is. You may be sure that someone is trying to cheat you. Yeah. He also mentions that meditation can help you dissolve your illusion of identity. And it turns out later on that he speaks from experience, because he meditates a lot. I believe that's not meditation with the sacred scripture, but probably transcendental meditation, another pillar of New Age.
then you depend on some form of slavery, for instance, where the peasants have to work very long hours for very little gain. So very few people can have plumbing. Then maybe you need to promise them that to get paid in the afterlife, the overtime, right? So you need a theocracy. And so for much of human history in the West, we had a combination of monarchy and theocracy. That was our form of governance, right? At the same time, the Catholic Church implemented game theoretic principles. I recently reread Thomas Aquinas. It's very interesting to see this because he was not a dualist. He was translating Aristotle in a particular way for designing an operating system for the Catholic society. And he says that basically people are animals, and very much the same way as Aristotle envisions, which basically organisms with cybernetic control. And then he says that there are additional rational principles that humans can discover, and everybody can discover them, so they are universal. If you are sane, you should understand, you should submit to them because you can rationally deduce them. And these principles are roughly, you should be willing to self-regulate correctly. You should be willing to do correct social regulation. It's intra-organismic. You should be willing to act on your models, so you have skin in the game. And you should have goal rationality. You should be choosing the right goals to work on. And so basically these three rational principles, goal rationality he calls prudence or wisdom. Social regulation is justice, the correct social one, and the internal regulation is temperance. And this thing, willingness to act on your models, is courage. And then he says that there are additionally to these four cardinal virtues, three divine virtues. And these three divine virtues cannot be rationally deduced, but they reveal themselves by their harmony, which means if you assume them and you extrapolate what's going to happen, you will see that they make sense. And it's often been misunderstood as God has to tell you that these are the things, so there's something nefarious going on. The Christian conspiracy forces you to believe some guy with a long beard that they discovered this. But so these principles are relatively simple. Again, you need... It's for high-level organization, for the resulting civilization that you form. Commitment to unity. So basically, you serve this higher, larger thing, this structural principle on the next level, and he calls that faith. Then there needs to be a commitment to shared purpose. This is basically this global reward that you try to figure out what that should be and how you can facilitate this, and this is love. The commitment to shared purpose is the core of love, right? You see this sacred thing that is more important than your own organismic interests in the other, and you serve this together, and this is how you see the sacred in the other. And the last one is hope, which means you need to be willing to act on that principle without getting rewards in the here and now, because it doesn't exist yet when you start out building the civilization, right? So you need to be able to do this in the absence of its actual existence yet, so it can come into being.
So the way it comes into being is by you accepting those notions, and then you see there these three divine concepts, and you see them realized.
And now the problem is divine is a loaded concept in our world, right? Because we are outside of this cult and we are still scarred from breaking free of it. But the idea is basically we need to have a civilization that acts as an intentional agent, like an insect state. And we are not actually a tribal species, we are a state-building species. And what enabled state building is basically the formation of religious states and other forms of rule-based administration in which the individual doesn't matter as much as the rule or the higher goal.
Right.
We got there by the question, what's the optimal form of governance? So I don't think that Catholicism is the optimal form of governance because it's obviously on the way out, right? So it is for the present type of society that we are in. Religious institutions don't seem to be optimal to organize that.
Again, he must have some serious beef with Catholicism for some reason. We've just broken away from this cult that manipulated us. But I really liked the reading of the cardinal virtues and the divine virtues. I wonder if there's anyone here to confirm that Aquinas said that people are animals, and if his way of looking at virtues was developed for the sake of building the state, for living in Catholic society, rather than getting to heaven.
Some mechanism perhaps must have planted the seed, the initial seed of the cell. Do you think there is a God? What is a God? And what would that look like?
So if there was no spontaneous abiogenesis, that in the sense that the first cell formed by some happy random accidents where the molecules just happen to be in the right constellation to each other.
But there could also be the mechanism of that allows for the random. I mean, there's like turtles all the way down. There has to be a head turtle at the bottom.
Let's consider something really wild. Imagine, is it possible that a gas giant could become intelligent? What would that involve? So imagine you have vortices that spontaneously emerge on the gas giants, like big storm systems that endure for thousands of years. And some of these storm systems produce electromagnetic fields because some of the clouds are ferromagnetic or something. And as a result, they can change how certain clouds react rather than other clouds, and thereby produce some self-stabilizing patterns that eventually lead to regulation, feedback loops, nested feedback loops, and control. So imagine you have such a thing that basically has emergent, self-sustaining, self-organizing complexity. And at some point this wakes up and realizes, and basically Lem Solaris, I am a thinking planet, but I will not replicate because I cannot recreate the conditions of my own existence somewhere else. I'm just basically an intelligence that has spontaneously formed because it could. And now it builds a von Neumann probe. And the best von Neumann probe for such a thing might be the cell. So maybe it, because it's very, very clever and very enduring, creates cells and sends them out, and one of them has infected our planet. And I'm not suggesting that this is the case, but it would be compatible with the panspermium hypothesis and with my intuition that abiogenesis is very unlikely. It's possible, but you probably need to roll the cosmic dice very often, maybe more often than there are planetary surfaces. I don't know.
So God is just a large enough, a system that's large enough that allows randomness.
No, I don't think that God has anything to do with creation. I think it's a mistranslation of the Talmud into the Catholic mythology. I think that Genesis is actually the childhood memories of a God. So
Genesis is the
childhood memories of a God. It's basically a mind that is remembering how it came into being. Wow. And we typically interpret Genesis as the creation of a physical universe by a supernatural being.
Yes.
And I think when you'll read it, there is light and darkness that is being created. And then you discover sky and ground. You create them. You construct the plants and the animals, and you give everything their names and so on. That's basically cognitive development. It's a sequence of steps that every mind has to go through when it makes sense of the world. And when you have children, you can see how initially they distinguish light and darkness, and then they make out directions in it, and they discover sky and ground, and they discover the plants and the animals, and they give everything their name. And it's a creative process that happens in every mind. Because it's not given, right? Your mind has to invent these structures to make sense of the patterns on your retina. Also, if there was some big nerd who set up a server and runs this world on it, this would not create a special relationship between us and the nerd. This nerd would not have the magical power to give meaning to our existence, right? So this equation of a creator god with the god of meaning is a sleight of hand. You shouldn't do it. The other one that is done in Catholicism is the equation of the first mover, the prime mover of Aristotle, which is basically the automaton that runs the universe. Aristotle says, if things are moving, and things seem to be moving here, something must move them, right? Mm-hmm. If something moves them, something must move the thing that is moving it. So there must be a prime mover. This idea to say that this prime mover is a supernatural being is complete nonsense, right? It's an automaton. In the simplest case.
Yeah, so God is not a creator. God is an automaton, machina ex deus, and then everyone's favorite, spontaneous emergence. Perfect.
Have you experienced low points in your life? Have you experienced depression?
Of course, we all experience low points in our life, and we get appalled by the things, by the ugliness of stuff around us. We might get desperate about our lack of self-regulation. And sometimes life is hard. And I suspect you don't get through your life, nobody does to get through their life without low points and without moments where they're despairing. And I thought that let's capture this state and how to deal with that state. And I found that very often you realize that when you stop taking things personally, when you realize that this notion of a person is a fiction, similar as it is in Westworld, where the robots realize that their memories and desires are just stuff that keeps them in the loop, and they don't have to act on those memories and desires, that our memories and expectations is what make us unhappy. And the present rarely does. The day in which we are, for the most part, it's okay, right? When we are sitting here, right now, we can choose how we feel. And the thing that affects us is the expectation that something is going to be different from what we want it to be, or the memory that something was different from what you wanted it to be. And once we basically zoom out from all this, what's left is not a person. What's left is this state of being conscious, which is a software state. And software doesn't have an identity. It's a physical law. And it's a law that acts in all of us, and it's embedded in a suitable substrate. And we didn't pick that substrate, right? We are mostly randomly instantiated on it. And there are all these individuals, and everybody has to be one of them. And eventually you're stuck on one of them and have to deal with that.
Okay, so it all fits in together perfectly. Nirvana, meditation, Gaia, dissolution of ego. You're not a person. No one is a person. You're just a state of consciousness, which is software. So you're basically already like AI.
Dimension of time. What's the agent in that for humans?
There is not just one. It depends on the way in which you're looking at the thing, in which you're framing it. Imagine that you are, say, Angela Merkel, and you are acting on behalf of Germany. Then you could say that Germany is the agent. And in the mind of Angela Merkel, she is Germany to some extent, because in the way in which she acts, the destiny of Germany changes. There are things that she can change that basically affect the behavior of that nation state.
Okay, so it's hierarchies of, to go to another one of your tweets with, I think you were playfully mocking Jeff Hawkins with saying his brain's all the way down. So it's like, it's agents all the way down. It's agents made up of agents made up of agents. Like if Angela Merkel's Germany, and Germany's made up of a bunch of people, and the people are themselves agents in some kind of context. And then the people are made up of cells, each individual. So is it agents all the way down?
I suspect that has to be like this in a world where things are self-organizing. Most of the complexity that we are looking at, everything in life is about self-organization.
Yeah.
So I think up from the level of life, you have agents. And below life, you rarely have agents, because sometimes you have control systems that emerge randomly in nature and try to achieve a set point, but they're not that interesting agents that make models. And because to make an interesting model of the world, you typically need a system that is Turing complete.
Again, a very nice display of ability to think symbolically and fractally about entities and beings. Good job, Joscha.
Complexity seems to be a necessary property of life. And I almost want to say it has ability to do something unexpected.
It seems to me that life is the main source of complexity on Earth.
Yes.
And complexity is basically a bridgehead that order builds into chaos by modeling, by processing information in such a way that you can perform reactions that would not be possible for dumb systems. And this means that you can harvest neg entropy that dumb systems cannot harvest. And this is what complexity is mostly about. Right?
Yeah.
In some sense, the purpose of life is to create complexity.
Yeah. Increasing. I mean, there seems to be some kind of universal drive towards increasing pockets of complexity. I don't know what that is. That seems to be like a fundamental, I don't know if it's a property of the universe or it's just a consequence of the way the universe works. But there seems to be this small pockets of emergent complexity that builds on top of each other and starts having like greater and greater complexity by having like a hierarchy of complexity, like little organisms building up a little society that then operates almost as an individual organism itself. And all of a sudden you have Germany and Merkel.
But that's not obvious to me. Everything that goes up has to come down at some point, right? So if you see this big exponential curve somewhere, it's usually the beginning of an S-curve, where something eventually reaches saturation. And the S-curve is the beginning of some kind of bump that goes down again. And there is just this thing that when you are inside of an evolution of life, you are on top of a puddle of negentropy that is being sucked dry by life. And during that happening, you see an increase in complexity. Because life forms are competing with each other to get more and more and finer and finer corner of that, like entropy extraction.
See, but that, I feel like that's a gradual, beautiful process. Like that's almost, follows a process akin to evolution. And the way it comes down is not the same way it came up. The way it comes down is usually harshly and quickly. So usually there's some kind of catastrophic event.
Well, the Roman Empire took a long time.
But that's, would you classify that as a decrease in complexity though?
Yes. I think that this size of the cities that could be fed has decreased dramatically. And you could see that the quality of the art decreased, and it did so gradually. And maybe future generations, when they look at the history of the United States in the 21st century, will also talk about the gradual decline, not something that suddenly happens.
Again, order and chaos, complexity and entropy. It's as if he has read Matthew Pajot's book.
You then, free will is an illusion.
No, it's a model, and it's a construct. It's basically a model that the system is making of its own behavior, and it's the best model that it can come up with under the circumstances, and it can get replaced by a different model, which is automatic behavior, when you fully understand the mechanism under which you are acting.
Yeah, but another word for model is what? Story. So it's the story you're telling. I mean, do you actually have control? Is there such a thing as a you, and is there such a thing as you having control? So like, are you manifesting your evolution as an entity?
In some sense, the you is the model of the system that is in control. It's a story that the system tells itself about somebody who is in control.
Yeah.
And the contents of that model are being used to inform the behavior of the system.
Okay.
So the system is completely mechanical, and the system creates that story like a loom, and then it uses the contents of that story to inform its actions and writes the results of that actions into the story.
So how is that not an illusion? The story is written then. Or rather, we're not the writers of the story.
Yes, but we always knew that.
No, we don't know that. When did we know that?
I think that's mostly a confusion about concepts. The conceptual illusion in our culture comes from the idea that we live in physical reality and that we experience physical reality and that we have ideas about it.
Yep.
And then you have this dualist interpretation where you have two substances, res extensa, the world that you can touch and that is made of extended things, and res cogitans, which is the world of ideas. And in fact, both of them are mental representations. One is the representations of the world as a game engine that your mind generates to make sense of the perceptual data. And the other one, yes, that's what we perceive as the physical world. But we already know that the physical world is nothing like that, right? Quantum mechanics is very different from what you and me perceive as the world. The world that you and me perceive is a game engine.
Yeah.
And there are no colors and sounds in the physical world. They only exist in the game engine generated by your brain. And then you have ideas that cannot be mapped onto extended regions, right? So the objects that have a spatial extension in the game engine are res extensa, and the objects that don't have a physical extension in the game engine are ideas. And they both interact in our mind to produce models of the world.
Yep, but,
Again, we live in a story. For a moment, I thought that, like, he's one of us. Joscha Bach is a symbolic thinker. But then you can notice that it's like the pendulum has swung, and now from radical materialism we are moving into radical immaterialism. Nothing material is real. The stained glass that I'm just playing with is just a construct in my head, and now in your head, because you're watching that. It's hard to wrap my mind around that.
And ones, right? You don't care about the width of the bus, you don't care about the nature of the CPU that it runs on. What you care about are the properties of the game that you're playing, and you hope that the CPU is good enough.
Yes.
And a similar thing happens when we interact with physics. The world that you and me are in is not the physical world. the world that you and me are in is a dream world.
How close is it to the real world, though?
We know that it's not very close, but we know that the dynamics of the dream world match the dynamics of the physical world to a certain degree of resolution. But the causal structure of the dream world is different. So you see, for instance, waves crashing on your feet, right? But there are no waves in the ocean. There's only water molecules that have tangents between the molecules that are the result of electrons in the molecules interacting with each other.
But aren't they like very consistent? We're just seeing a very crude approximation. Isn't our dream world very consistent, like to the point of being mapped directly one-to-one to the actual physical world, as opposed to us being completely tricked? This is like where you have like Donald.
It's not a trick. That's my point. It's not an illusion. It's a form of data compression.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to deal with the dynamics of too many parts to count at the level at which we're entangled with the best model that you can find.
Yeah. So we can act in that dream world, and our actions have impact in the real world, in the physical world.
Yes.
To which we don't have access.
Yes. But it's basically like accepting the fact that the software that we live in, the dream that we live in, is generated by something outside of this world that you and me are in.
So
now, a minute ago, we heard a display of fractal symbolic thinking. And here again we're back to reductionism. The waves are not real, there's only molecules. That seems like a contradiction of his previous words.
The model that you have of reality is real in as far as it is a model, right? It's an appropriate description of the world to say that there are models that are being experienced. Mm-hmm. But the world that you experience is not necessarily implemented. There is a difference between a reality, a simulation, and a simulacrum. Mm-hmm. The reality that we're talking about is something that fully emerges over a causally closed lowest layer. And the idea of physicalism is that we are in that layer, that basically our world emerges over that. Every alternative to physicalism is a simulation theory, which basically says that we are in some kind of simulation universe and the real world needs to be an apparent universe of that, where the actual causal structure is, right? Mm-hmm. And when you look at the ocean and your own mind, you are looking at a simulation that explains what you're going to see next.
So we are living in a simulation.
Yes, but a simulation generated by our own brains.
Yeah.
And this simulation is different from the physical reality because the causal structure that is being produced, what you are seeing, is different from the causal structure of physics.
But consistent.
Hopefully. If not, then you are going to end up in some kind of institution where people will take care of you because your behavior will be inconsistent, right? Your behavior needs to work in such a way that it's interacting with an accurately predictive model of reality. And if your brain is unable to make your model of reality predictive, you will need help. So
what do you think about Donald Hoffman's argument that it doesn't have to be consistent, the dream world, to the what he calls like the interface to the actual physical reality, where there could be evolution? I think he makes an evolutionary argument, which is like it could be an evolutionary advantage to have the dream world drift away from physical reality.
I think that only works if you have tenure. As long as you're still interacting with the ground truth, your model needs to be somewhat predictive.
Tenure. Well, in some sense, humans have achieved a kind of tenure in the animal kingdom.
Yeah. And at some point, we became too big to fail, so we became postmodernist.
It all makes sense now.
The version of reality that we like.
Oh, man. Okay.
But basically, you can do magic. You can change your assessment of reality, but eventually reality is going to come bite you in the ass if it's not predictive.
I just love this take on postmodernism, so I put this fragment in here. That's it.
Wrong. And like a dance between those.
I found that when I watched the Miyazaki movies, that there is nobody who captures my spirituality as well as he does. It's very interesting and just vicious. Right, there is something going on in his movies that is very interesting. So, for instance, Mononoke is discussing not only an answer to Disney's simplistic notion of Mowgli, the jungle boy who's raised by wolves, and as soon as he sees people, realizes that he's one of them, and the way in which the moral life in nature is simplified and romanticized and turned into kitsch right? It's disgusting in the Disney movie, and he answers to this. You see, he's replaced by Mononoke, this wolf girl who was raised by wolves and who is fierce and dangerous and who cannot be socialized because she cannot be tamed. It cannot be part of human society. And you see human society, it's something that is very, very complicated. You see people extracting resources and destroying nature. But the purpose is not to be evil, but to be able to have a life that is free from, for instance, oppression and violence, and to curb death and disease. And you basically see this conflict which cannot be resolved in a certain way. You see this moment when nature is turned into a garden and it loses most of what it actually is, when humans no longer are submitting to life and death in nature. And to these questions, there is no easy answer. So he just turns it into something that is being observed as a journey that happens, and that happens with a certain degree of inevitability. And the nice thing about all his movies is there's a certain main character, and it's the same in all movies. It's this little girl that is basically Heidi, and I suspect that happened because when he did field work for working on the Heidi movies, back then the Heidi animations, before he did his own movies, he traveled to Switzerland and Southeastern Europe and the Adriatic and so on, and got an idea about a certain aesthetic and a certain way of life that informed his future thinking. And Heidi has a very interesting relationship to herself and to the world. There is nothing that she takes for herself. She is in a way fearless because she is committed to a service, to a greater whole. Basically, she is completely committed to serving God. And it's not an institutionalized God. It has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church or something like this. But in some sense, Heidi is an embodiment of the spirit of European Protestantism. Mm-hmm. It's this idea of a being that is completely perfect and pure. And it's not a feminist vision, because she is not a girl boss or something like this. She is the justification for the men in the audience to protect her, to build a civilization around her that makes her possible. Right? So she is not just the sacrifice of Jesus, who is innocent and therefore nailed to the cross. She is not being sacrificed. She is being protected by everybody around her who recognizes that she is sacred, and there are enough around her to see that. Right? So that's a very interesting perspective. There's a certain notion of innocence. And this notion of innocence is not universal. It's not in all cultures, right? Hitler wasn't innocent. His idea of Germany was not that there is an innocence that is being protected. There was a predator that was going to triumph.
Yeah.
And it's also something that is not at the core of every religion. There are many religions which don't care about innocence. They might care about increasing the status of something, right? And that's a very interesting notion that is quite unique. And I'm not claiming it's the optimal one. It's just a particular kind of aesthetic, which I think makes Miyazaki into the most relevant Protestant philosopher today.
Well, since we are mostly an anime channel here, I had to put in this fragment. And it's nice to learn that Joscha Bach likes anime and also sees that it's often more profound than Western animation. I like that he notices the concept of innocence. I think in Christianity we'd rather say purity that we want to protect. But again, why not Catholic? Why Catholic is so bad in all that?
Told in my childhood that communism was a hypothetical society to which we were in a permanent revolution that justified everything that was presently wrong with society, morally. But it was something that our grandchildren probably would not ever see, because it was too ideal and too far in the future to make it happen right now. And people were just not there yet morally. And the same thing happened with Christianity, right? This notion of heaven was mythologized and projected into an afterlife. And I think this was just the idea of God's kingdom, of this world in which we instantiate the next level transcendental agent in the perfect form. So everything goes smoothly and without violence and without conflict and without this human messiness, on this economic messiness and the terror and coercion that existed in the present societies. And the idea of whether humans can exist at scale in a harmonious way, non-coercively, is untested. Right? Or a lot of people tested it but didn't get it to work so far. And the utopia is a world in where you get all the good things without any of the bad things. And you are, I think, very susceptible to believe in utopias when you are very young and don't understand that everything has to happen in causal patterns, that there is always feedback loops that ultimately are closed. There's nothing that just happens because it's good or bad. Good or bad don't exist in isolation. They only exist with respect to larger systems.
So
now you could say that about Christianity, that it is a utopia, if it was actually in our beliefs that we are trying to make a perfect society where no one commits any sins anymore. But it has never been the goal of Christianity. We were never trying to pretend that this is what we are going to achieve here on Earth.
In some sense, I learned a lot about costumes at Burning Man. Before that, I did not really appreciate costumes and saw them more as uniforms, like wearing a suit if you are working in a bank, or if you are trying to get startup funding from a VC in Switzerland. Right, then you dress up in a particular way, and this is mostly to show the other side that you are willing to play by the rules and you understand what the rules are. But there is something deeper. When you are at Burning Man, your costume becomes self-expression, and there is no boundary to the self-expression. You're basically free to wear what you want, to express other people what you feel like this day, and what kind of interactions you want to have.
is the costume a kind of projection of who you are?
That's very hard to say, because the costume also depends on what other people see in the costume. And this depends on the context that the other people understand. And so you have to create something, if you want to, that is legible to the other side, and that means something to yourself.
Mm-hmm. Do we become prisoners of the costume? Because everybody expects us
Some people do, but I think that once you realize that you wear a costume at Burning Man, a variety of costumes, realize that you cannot not wear a costume.
Yeah.
Right. Basically, everything that you wear and present to others is something that is to some degree in addition to what you are deep inside. No, it's not quite the same. So basically, when you are wearing a costume at Burning Man and say you are an extraterrestrial prince, that's something where you are expressing, in some sense, something that's closer to yourself than the way in which you hide yourself behind standard clothing when you go out in the city, in the default world. And so this costume that you're wearing at Burning Man allows you to express more of yourself, and you have a shorter distance of advertising to people what kind of person you are, what kind of interaction you would want to have with them. And so you get much earlier into medias res. And I believe it's regrettable that we do not use the opportunities that we have with custom-made clothing now to wear costumes that are much more stylish, that are much more custom-made, that are not necessarily part of a fashion in which you express which milieu you're part of and how up-to-date you are, but you also express how you are as an individual and what you want to do today and how you feel today and what you intend to do about it.
Well, isn't it easier now in the digital world to explore different costumes? I mean, that's the kind of idea with virtual reality. That's the idea, even with Twitter and two-dimensional screens. You can swap all costumes. You can be as weird as you want. It's easier. For Burning Man, you have to order things. You have to make things. It's more effort to
It's
put
even better if you make them yourselves.
Sure, but it's just easier to do digitally, right?
It's not about easy. It's about how to get it right. And for me, the first Burning Man experience, I got adopted by a bunch of people in Boston who dragged me to Burning Man. And we spent a few weekends doing costumes together. And it was an important part of the experience where the camp bonded, that people got to know each other. And we basically grew into the experience that we would have later.
So the extraterrestrial prince is based on a true story?
Yeah.
I wonder if all of you are familiar with what the Burning Man festival is. I think it would require a whole other video to talk about the symbols in that. However, from my perspective, as far as I've seen pictures and videos from it, it's the most pagan and satanic festival we have in the world today. I think that Californians just love it. The Silicon Valley just flocks to that place. It's interesting how, I mentioned in the beginning the things going on spiritually in Eastern Germany, especially in Berlin, and there are some Berlin festivals, like techno festivals as well, or parades where you could really feel the evil spirit roaming around. And it is very similar to whatever's going on in Switzerland when they were opening the tunnel of sorts a few years ago, or the sculptures that they have by CERN, or in California where they really worship Moloch, you'd say. I think these three places are somewhat connected.
Okay,
Stage
so
6.
Stage 6, at some point you can collapse the division between self, a personal self, and world generator again. And a lot of people get there via meditation, or some of them get there via psychedelics, some of them by accident. And you suddenly notice that you are not actually a person, but you are a vessel that can create a person. And the person is still there. You observe that personal self, but you observe the personal self from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice it's a representation. And you might also notice that the world that is being created is a representation. If not, then you might experience that I am the universe. I am the thing that is creating everything. And of course, what you're creating is not quantum mechanics and the physical universe. What you're creating is this game engine that is updating the world, and you're creating your valence, your feelings, and all the people inside of that world, including the person that you identify with yourself in this world.
Are you creating the game engine, or are you noticing the game engine?
You noticed how you're generating the game engine. And I mean, when you are dreaming at night, you can, if you have a lucid dream, you can learn how to do this deliberately. And in principle, you can also do it during the day. And the reason why we don't get to do this from the beginning, and why we don't have agency of our feelings right away, is because we would game it before they have the necessary amount of wisdom to deal with creating this dream that we are in.
Yeah, meditation, psychedelics, how predictable. Why all the IT nerds just like that?
So you mentioned there the non-dual state, and say that some people confuse it for enlightenment.
Yeah.
What's the non-dual state?
There is a state in which you notice that you are no longer a person, and instead you are one with the universe.
So that speaks to the resonance.
Yes, but this one with the universe is, of course, not accurately modeling that you are indeed some God entity, or indeed the universe is becoming aware of itself, even though you get this experience. I believe that you get this experience because your mind is modeling the fact that you are no longer identified with the personal self in that state, but you have transcended this division between the self model and the world model, and you are experiencing yourself as your mind, as something that is representing a universe.
But that's still part of the model.
Yes. So it's inside of the model. Still, you're still inside of patterns that are generated in your brain and in your organism. And what you are now experiencing is that you're no longer this personal self in there, but you are the entirety of the mind and its contents.
It's funny how those both extremes seem to be one thing. Oneness with the world, the solution of your identity, and radical solipsism. It's all in my mind.
You're right. Instead of treating eyes, ears, and skin as separate sensory systems with fundamentally different modalities, we might understand them as overlapping aspects of the same universe, coupled at the same temporal resolution, and almost inseparable from a single shared resonant model. Instead of treating mental representations as fully isolated between minds, the representations of physically adjacent observers might directly interact and produce causal effects through the coordination of the perception and behavior of world modeling observers. So the modalities, the distinction between modalities, let's throw that away. The distinction between the individuals, let's throw that away. So what does this interaction representations look like?
When you think about how you represent the interaction of us in this room, at some level, you can the modalities are quite distinct. They're not completely distinct, but you can see this as vision. You can close your eyes, and then you don't see a lot anymore. But you still imagine how my mouth is moving when you hear something, and you know that it's very close to the sound that you can just open your eyes and you get back into this shared merged space. And we also have these experiments where we notice that the way in which my lips are moving are affecting how you hear the sound. And also vice versa. The sounds that you're hearing have an influence on how you interpret some of the visual features. And so these modalities are not separate in your mind. They are merged at some fundamental level where you are interpreting the entire scene that you're in. And your own interactions in the scene are also not completely separate from the interactions of the other individual in the scene. But there is some resonance that is going on where we also have a degree of shared mental representations and shared empathy due to being in the same space and having vibes between each other.
Vibes. So the question, though, is how deeply intertwined is this multimodality, multi-agent system? Like how, I mean, this is going to the telepathy question without the woo-woo meaning of the word telepathy. It's like how, like what's going on here in this room right now?
So if telepathy would work, how could it work?
Yeah.
Right. So imagine that all the cells in your body are sending signals in a similar way as neurons are doing. Right? Just by touching the other cells and sending chemicals to them, the other cells interpreting them, learning how to react to them. And they learn how to approximate functions in this way and compute behavior for the organisms. And this is something that is open to plants as well. Right? So plants probably have software running on them that is controlling how the plant is working in a similar way as you have a mind that is controlling how you are behaving in the world. And this spirit of plants is something that has been very well described by our ancestors, and they found this quite normal. But for some reason, since the Enlightenment, we are treating this notion that there are spirits in nature and that plants have spirits as a superstition. And I think we probably have to rediscover that plants have software running on them. And we already did, right? I mean, we noticed that there is a control system in the plant that connects every part of the plant to every other part of the plant and produces coherent behavior in the plant. That is, of course, much, much slower than the coherent behavior in an animal like us that has a nervous system where everything is synchronized much, much faster by the neurons. But what you also notice is that if a plant is sitting next to another plant, like you have a very old tree, and this tree is building some kind of information highway along its cells, so it can send information from its leaves to its roots and from some part of the root to another part of the roots, and there is a fungus living next to the tree, the fungus can probably piggyback on the communication between the cells of the tree and send its own signals to the tree. And vice versa, the tree might be able to send information to the fungus. Because after all, how would they build a viable firewall if that other organism is sitting next to them all the time and is never moving away? Right? So they will have to get along. And over a long enough time frame, the networks of roots in the forest and all the other plants that are there and the fungi that are there might be forming something like a biological internet.
But the question there is, do they have to be touching? Is biology at a distance possible?
Of course, you can use any kind of physical signal. You can use sounds, you can use electromagnetic waves that are integrated over many cells. So it's conceivable that across distances, there are many kinds of information pathways. But also, our planetary surface is pretty full of organisms, full of cells.
So everything is touching everything else.
Yeah, and it's been doing this for many millions and even billions of years. So there was enough time for information processing networks to form. And if you think about how a mind is self-organizing, basically it needs to, in some sense, reward the cells for computing the mind, for building the necessary dynamics between the cells that allow the mind to stabilize itself and remain on there. But if you look at these spirits of plants that are growing very close to each other in the forest, that might be almost growing into each other, these spirits might be able even to move to some degree, not to become somewhat dislocated. and shift around in that ecosystem, right? And so if you think about what a mind is, it's a bunch of activation waves that form coherent patterns and process information in a way that are colonizing an environment well enough to allow the continuous sustenance of the mind, the continuous stability and self-stabilization of the mind. Then it's conceivable that we can link into this biological internet, not necessarily at the speed of our nervous system, but maybe at the speed of our body, and make some kind of subconscious connection to the world where we use our body as an antenna into biological information processing. Now, these ideas are completely speculative. I don't know if any of that is true. But if that was true, and if you want to explain telepathy, I think it's much more likely that that telepathy could be explained using such mechanisms rather than undiscovered quantum processes that would break the standard model of physics.
I'm sorry for such a long fragment, but I wanted to illustrate Joscha Bach's view on Gaia more thoroughly. What's wrong with the concept of Gaia? Why? It's time to say why we as Christians cannot accept it. Because you see, the church is also a type of oneness. We are all a part of Christ's body. Could Christ's body be like Gaia? Now you see, when we are the church has its goals, has its direction, and this direction is towards God. And first in enlightenment, we got rid of God and put the man in the center. And now what it seems to be happening with all this Gaia cult and all the AI stuff that Joscha is talking about, it seems to be removing even the human from the center and putting their life, everything, chaos, because Gaia is everything, so it's not directed towards anything particular. It's all life, all potential. It's interesting that when you put God at the top in his proper spot, then everything falls down into their places properly. The hierarchy is proper. But once you remove God, you have to remove everything one by one. It only takes some time to remove values, to remove humans, and then eventually to remove, I don't know, maybe life itself as well. So although we notice that, okay, so we are all a part of everything on some level, and it is a Christian concept, it is a symbolic concept that we form a bigger whole. But there's something very different about Gaia versus the church.
A possibility that we see that a few bits can be traveling long distance between organisms using biological information processing in ways that we are not completely aware of right now, and that are more similar to many of the stories that were completely normal for our ancestors.
Well, this kind of interlined representations takes us to the big ending of your tweet series. You write, quote, "I wonder if self-improving AGI might end up saturating physical environments with intelligence to such a degree that isolation of individual mental states becomes almost impossible, and the representations of all complex self-organizing agents merge permanently with each other." So that's a really interesting idea. This biological network, life network, gets so dense that it might as well be seen as one. That's an interesting, what do you think that looks like? What do you think that saturation looks like? What does it feel like?
I think it's a possibility. It's just a vague possibility. And I like to explain. But what is looks like, I think, that the end game of AGI is substrate agnostic. That means that AGI ultimately, if it is being built, is going to be smart enough to understand how AGI works. Mm-hmm. This means it's not going to be better than people at AGI research and can take over in building the next generation, but it fully understands how it works and how it's being implemented. And also, of course, understands how computation works in nature, how to build new feedback loops that you can turn into your own circuits. And this means that the AGI is likely to virtualize itself into any environment that can compute. So it's not breaking free from the silicon substrate and is going to move into the ecosystems, into our bodies, our brains, and is going to merge with all the agency that it finds there.
Yeah.
So it's conceivable that you end up with completely integrated information processing across all computing systems, including biological computation on Earth. That we end up triggering some new step in the evolution where basically some Gaia is being built over the entirety of all digital and biological computation until the boundary of your mind. And if that boundary is no longer clear-cut, because AI is jumping across substrates, it would be interesting to see what a global mind would look like. That is basically producing a globally coherent language of thought and is representing everything from all the possible vantage points.
That's an interesting world.
The intuition that this thing grew out of is a particular mental state, and it's a state that you find sometimes in literature. For instance, Neil Gaiman describes it in The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that, or this experience, that there is a state in which you feel that you know everything that can be known, and that in your normal human mind, you've only forgotten. You've forgotten that you are the entire universe. And some people describe this after they've taken extremely large amount of mushrooms or had a big spiritual experience as a hippie in their 20s, and they notice basically that they are in everything, and their body is only one part of the universe and nothing ends at their body, and actually everything is observing, and they are part of this big observer, and the big observer is focused as one local point in their body and their personality and so on. But we can basically have this oceanic state in which you have no boundaries and are one with everything. And a lot of meditators call this the non-dual state, because you no longer have the separation between self and world. And as I said, you can explain the state relatively simply without panpsychism or anything else, but just by breaking down the constructed boundary between self and world in our own mind. But if you combine this with the notion that systems are physically interacting to the point where their representations are merging and interacting with each other, you would literally implement something like this. Mm-hmm. Right? It would still be a representational state. You would not be one with physics itself. It would still be coarse-grained. It would still be much slower than physics itself. But it would be a representation in which you become aware that you're part of some kind of global information processing system, like thought and a global mind.
Thank you, Gendo Ikari.
And people should definitely follow your Twitter, because you explore these questions in a beautiful, profound, and hilarious way at times.
No, don't follow my Twitter. I already have too many followers.
Yeah.
At some point, it's going to be unpleasant. I noticed that a lot of people feel that it's totally okay to punch up, and it's a very weird notion that you feel that you haven't changed, but your account has grown, and suddenly you have a lot of people who casually abuse you. Mm-hmm. And I don't like that I have to block more than before, and I don't like this overall vibe shift. And right now it's still somewhat okay, so pretty much okay, so I can go to a place where people work on stuff that I'm interested in, and there's a good chance that a few people in the room know me, so there's no awkwardness. But when I get to a point where random strangers feel that they have to have an opinion about me one way or the other, I don't think I would like that.
And random strangers, because of your kind of in their mind elevated position.
Yes. So basically, whenever you are in any way prominent or some kind of celebrity, random strangers will have to have an opinion about you.
And here I am. Sorry, Joscha. You're too significant to be left alone, especially if you are a de facto leader of the world. I think we need to watch you and have opinions about what your views are, if you are going to lead us into a new era.
I suspect that it's there in plain sight in Genesis 1, in this first book of the Bible, where it's being described that this creative spirit is hovering over the substrate and then is creating a boundary between the world model and sphere of ideas, earth and heaven, as they're being described there. And then it's creating contrast, and then dimensions, and then space. And then it creates organic shapes and solids and liquids and builds a world from them and creates plants and animals, gives them all their names. And once that's done, it creates another spirit in its own image, but it creates it as man and woman, as something that thinks of itself as a human being and puts it into this world. And the Christians mistranslate this, I suspect, when they say this is the description of the creation of the physical universe by a supernatural being. I think this is literally a description of how in every mind a universe is being created as some kind of game engine by a creative spirit, our first consciousness that emerges in our mind even before we are born. And that creates the interaction between organism and world. And once that is built and trained, the personal self is being created, and we only remember being the personal self. We no longer remember how we created the game engine.
So God, in this view, is the first creative mind in the
It's the first consciousness. And
in the early days, in the early months of development.
And it's still there. You still have this outer mind that creates your sense of whether you're being loved by the world or not, and what your place in the world is. Right? It's something that is not yourself that is producing this. It's your mind that does it. So there is an outer mind that basically is an agent that determines who you are with respect to the world. And while you are stuck being that personal self in this world until you get to stage 6 and you destroy the boundary.
Okay, so we are the God, of course. Of course we are the God. But what is this outer mind? I just cannot get it. Did anyone get it? What is this outer mind that he's referring to here?
Let me bring up Eliezer Yudkowsky and his warnings to human civilization that AI will likely kill all of us. What are your thoughts about his perspective on this? Can you steelman his case? And what aspects with it do you disagree?
One thing that I find concerning in the discussion of his arguments that many people are dismissive of his arguments, but the counter arguments that they're giving are not very convincing to me. And so based on this state of discussion, I find that from Eliezer's perspective, and I think I can take that perspective to some approximate degree that probably is nowhere near at his intellectual level, but it's I think I see what he's up to and why he feels the way he does, and it makes total sense. I think that his perspective is somewhat similar to the perspective of Ted Kaczynski, the infamous lunar bomber, and not that Eliezer would be willing to send pipe bombs to anybody to blow them up. But when he wrote this Times article in which he warned about AI being likely to kill everybody and that we would need to stop its development or halt it, I think there is a risk that he's taking that somebody might get violent if they read this and get really, really scared. Right? So I think that there is some consideration that he's making where he's already going in this direction where he has to take responsibility if something happens and people get harmed. And the reason why Ted Kaczynski did this was that from his own perspective, technological society cannot be made sustainable. It's doomed to fail. It's going to lead to an environmental and eventually also a human holocaust in which we die because of the environmental destruction, the destruction of our food chains, the pollution of the environment. And so from Kaczynski's perspective, we need to stop industrialization, we need to stop technology, we need to go back because he didn't see a way moving forward, right? Mm-hmm. And I suspect that in some sense there's a similarity in Eliezer's thinking to this kind of fear about progress. And I'm not dismissive about this at all. I take it quite seriously. And I think that there is a chance that could happen that if we build machines that get control over processes that are crucial for the regulation of life on Earth, and we no longer have agency to influence what's happening there, that this might create large-scale disasters for us.
Do you have a sense that the march towards this uncontrollable autonomy of superintelligent systems is inevitable? That there's no, I mean, that's essentially what he's saying, that there's no hope. His advice to young people was prepare for a short life.
I don't think that's useful. I think that from a pragmatic perspective, you have to bet always on the timelines in which you are alive. Doesn't make sense to have a financial bet in which you bet that the financial system is going to disappear, right? Yeah. Because there cannot be any payout for you. So in principle, you only need to bet on the timelines in which you're still around, or people that you matter about, or things that you matter about, maybe consciousness on Earth. Mm-hmm. But there is a deeper issue for me personally, and that is, I don't think that life on Earth is about humans. I don't think it's about human aesthetics. I don't think it's about Eliezer and his friends, even though I like them. It's there is something more important happening, and this is complexity on Earth resisting entropy by building structure that develops agency and awareness. And that's, to me, very beautiful. And we are only a very small part of that larger thing. We are a species that is able to be coherent a little bit individually over very short time frames. Mm-hmm. But as a species, we are not very coherent. As a species, we are children. We basically are very joyful and energetic and experimental and explorative, and sometimes desperate and sad and grieving and hurting. But we don't have a respect for duty as a species. As a species, we do not think about what is our duty to life on Earth and to our own survival. So we make decisions that look good in the short run, but in the long run might prove disastrous. And I don't really see a solution to this. So in my perspective, as a species, as a civilization, we're per default dead. We are in a very beautiful time in which we have found this giant deposit of fossil fuels in the ground and use it, and to build a fantastic civilization in which we don't need to worry about food and clothing and housing for the most part, in a way that is unprecedented in life on Earth for any kind of conscious observer, I think. And this time is probably going to come to an end in a way that is not going to be smooth. And when we crash, it could be also that we go extinct, probably not near term, but ultimately I don't have very high hopes that humanity is around in 1 million years from now. So I don't think that life on Earth will end with us, right? There's going to be more complexity. There's more intelligent species after us. There's probably more interesting phenomena in the history of consciousness. But we can contribute to this. And part of our contribution is that we are currently trying to build thinking systems that are potentially lucid, that understand what they are and what their condition to the universe is, and can make choices about this, that are not built from organisms, and that are potentially much faster and much more conscious than human beings can be. And these systems will probably not completely displace life on Earth, but they will coexist with it. And they will build all sorts of agency in the same way as biological systems build all sorts of agency. And that, to me, is extremely fascinating, and it's probably something that we cannot stop from happening. So I think right now there is a very good chance that it happens, and there are very few ways in which we can produce a coordinated effect to stop it, in the same way as it's very difficult for us to make a coordinated effort to stop production of carbon dioxide. Right? So it's probably going to happen. And the thing that's going to happen is going to lead to a change of how life on Earth is happening. But I don't think the result is some kind of gray goo. It's not something that's going to dramatically reduce the complexity in favor of something stupid. I think it's going to make life on Earth and consciousness on Earth way more interesting.
So more higher complex consciousness,
yes,
will make the lesser consciousnesses flourish even more.
I suspect that what could very well happen, if you're lucky, is that we get integrated into something larger.
Now you see, this is what I meant when I was talking about Gaia. So he sees that there are those threats to AI and that humanity might cease to exist in the foreseeable future. But he's okay with that. So okay, there is this threat, but it's okay, because humans are not central to our idea. The central idea is life itself. So life, as this Gaia, is put on the pedestal as something that is supposed to be cherished and protected and made sure to continue. And we are just a speck of dust in all that. We got rid of God, we got rid of humans, now we cherish life. We worship life. So it's important for life, who knows what type of and what form of life, but it's important for life to prevail. Why? Why should this be central? Why should this be important rather than for us to keep humanity continuing?
Abilities, and they're negotiable to some degree, I would press the button.
But isn't this everything? This love you have for other humans, you can call it responsibility, but that connection, that's the ego death. Isn't that the thing we're really afraid of? Is not to just die, but to let go of the experience of love with other humans.
This is not everything. Everything is everything, right? So there's so much more. And you could be lots of other things. You could identify with lots of other things. You could be identifying with being Gaia, some kind of planetary control agent that emerges over all the activity of life on Earth. You could be identifying with some hyper Gaia, that is the concatenation of Gaia with all the digital life and digital minds. And so in this sense, there will be agents in all sorts of substrates and directions that all have their own goals. And when they're not sustainable, then these agents will cease to exist. Or when the agent feels that it's done with its own mission, it will cease to exist. In the same way as when you conclude a thought, the thought is going to wrap up and gives control over to other thoughts in your own mind. So there is no single thing that you need to do. But what I observe myself is that sometimes I'm a parent, and then I have an identification and a job as a parent, and sometimes I am an agent of consciousness on Earth, and then from this perspective there's other stuff that is important. So this is my main issue with Eliezer's perspective, that he's basically marrying himself to a very narrow human aesthetic. And that narrow human aesthetic is a temporary thing. Humanity is a temporary species, like most of the species on this planet are only around for a while, and then they get replaced by other species, in a similar way as our own physical organism is around here for a while, and then gets replaced by the next generation of human beings that are adapted to changing life circumstances on average via mutation and selection. And it's only when we have AI and become completely software that we become infinitely adaptable, and we don't have this generational and species change anymore. So if you take this larger perspective and you realize it's really not about us, it's not about Eliezer or humanity, but it's about life on Earth, or it's about defeating entropy for as long as we can, while being as interesting as we can, right? Then the perspective changes dramatically, and AI, preventing AI from this perspective looks like a very big sin.
Why? Where did you get this hierarchy of values? Why are these things important and not others? I cannot understand. And I think I'll go back to my stained glass window making. I really enjoy it. It's fun. I've already made 3 of these. What do you think of Joscha's views? What do you think about his hierarchy of values? Do you feel safe with him as a leader of our technological progress? He's a brilliant man after all. please share in the comments.